Welcome everyone. In what follows, I'd like to present a brief overview over David Hume's theory of mind and his view of the external world and cause and effect, or causality for short. So, as I said, it will be brief, but still perhaps something can be gathered from this. In an inquiry concerning human understanding, David Hume writes the following. A blind man can form no notion of colors, a deaf man of no sounds. Restore either of them that sense in which he is deficient, and by opening this new inlet for his sensations, you also open an inlet for the ideas, and he finds no difficulty in conceiving these objects. Now, bit unclear language, let's say, to speak of colors and sounds as objects, but such is the nature of David Hume's writing. David Hume, of course, is commonly known as one of the three, or the last of the three great British empiricists. John Locke would be the first, Bishop Berkeley the second, and David Hume completes the triumvirate. And as you may know, Kant famously credited him, or seemingly credited him, for interrupting his dogmatic slumbers, which gave his, to quote Kant, investigations in the field of speculative philosophy a quite new direction. So, the dogmatic slumbers, though, from which Kant did awake thanks to Hume's skepticism and the attacks by the skeptic, which Kant does not accept, did turn Kant towards critical philosophy, but at the same time, so a critique of reason and its excesses. But at the same time, Kant, of course, also saw in Hume a dogmatic thinker, a dogmatic skeptic, so he had a black mirror in front of him there, let's say. Now, briefly on Hume's theory of mind. Hume believes that we cannot know anything about the external world with certainty. Hence, the only thing, let's say, that can be studied is the mind. But it is one, well, the only thing, let's say, put it like this, what we should begin our studies with is the mind in order to infer a few things about the external world, however, not ever with certainty. But it's one of Hume's main concerns to understand where human knowledge comes from, how valid it is, and to what extent we can know it all. The mind is researched in the typical way of the Scottish Enlightenment. Furthermore, Hume shows skepticism with regard to reason, as he says himself. That is to say, the capacities it has and what we can know about its functioning. Hume, on the one hand, does assert that, quote from Hume, humans naturally reason. And on the other hand, however, he strictly wants to oppose the Cartesian or traditional understanding or conception of rationality, which in Descartes would be seen as an independent faculty, independent entirely of the senses. Humans in their entirety are necessarily part of the world. Their mind is not detached from the physical sphere, as in the dualistic view, Cartesian view, to simplify Descartes. This has certain implications. In the latter conception, let's say in Descartes, human beings are capable of calculating information provided on a quantitative basis, and they will at all times rationally adjust their behavior accordingly and also come to the same or similar rational conclusions. Here, the mind is therefore transparent to itself. By the way, this has ramifications for economic theory. John Maynard Keynes was a Cartesian rationalist. The notion of the homo economicus which is usually attributed to Adam Smith, which is a bit misleading, frankly, because Smith, who was good friends with Hume, would not have believed in the Homo economicus in the way that we have constructed the Homo economicus, is based in a Cartesian subjectivity where the I is stable and transparent to itself. There is here a, let's say for in a Cartesian framework, a stable I or ego, whereas for Hume, no such thing as the quote from Hume, the idea of the self exists, since there is no impression of the self constant and invariable. Now, in economic terms, again, the transparent I means, for example, that consumers perfectly know, as that would be the assumption, they know their preferences and how to achieve their goals, since also the external world is simply a set of static objects, or in crude Cartesian terms, is sheer extension and hence can be mathematically quantified and is thus calculable, as are our desires or our rational inclinations. But for Hume, all depends on qualitative perception. Experience makes a difference. Quote from Hume, all this creative power of the mind amounts to no more than the faculty of compounding, transposing, augmenting, or diminishing the materials afforded to us by the senses and experience. Thus, for Hume, reason is externally limited by experience. Internally, our reason is limited by, quote from Hume, the inconstancy of our mental powers. A reason why we cannot find truth, or ultimate absolute truth. Yet how do we form knowledge, if at all? We perceive impressions through our senses, and therefrom we form ideas. Impressions are characterized as being of great vivacity and force. It is this quality that tempts us to believe that what we have sensed in the past is still existent. Hence, to quote again from Hume, impressions are the causes of our ideas, and to prove the dependence of ideas on impressions, Hume demands us to, quote, consider the order of their first appearance, and find by constant experience that the simple impression always takes the precedence of their correspondent ideas, but never appear in the contrary order. In a way, of course, you can see that this is an inversion of Plato's theory of forms. This kind of knowledge, received through observation and experience, Hume then calls a knowledge of matters of fact. It is never a certain form of knowledge, as our experience can be ill-founded, or we, of course, are prone to, for example, illusion, etc. Knowledge outside of personal experience is possible only in terms of relation of ideas. Mathematics, for example, operates on this level. Here, certain knowledge is possible since only the basic concepts from which it starts are analyzed. The knowledge here is true by logic alone, while in knowledge of matters of fact it must be experienced, learned, and constantly tested through the senses for the sake of validity. Knowledge of matters of fact thus seeks to establish causal relationships while never being able fully to attain to be certain about the latter's about the causal relationship's validity. The important aspect for the discussion here is the emphasis on memory and especially experience. Our memory and experience, or memorized experience, delineate what we can know. They thus also restrict it. Every new impression is compared to a stored impression, that is to say, a piece of memory. So you can see that, and according to Hume, the mind is a sort of association machine. New impressions are more likely to being processed if they are recognized as similar to an old one. But there is also something deeper going on here, perhaps, in the sense that we are not just by associating different ideas or impressions with ideas and impressions that we've already had or have stored in us, but that instead there is perhaps also, not in Hume per se, but there is room for analogy. Hume's, now we move on to the Hume's view, really his crude skepticism regarding the external world and cause and effect. Now, he's not Bishop Berkeley. He does not think that all that is are ideas sent to us from God. There is an external world. However, we cannot make certain propositions about it. Hume's skepticism, of course, is notorious. According to Friedrich Hayek, the Austrian economist, it was Hume's skepticism was the reason why Hume, for so long, according to Hayek, has not been taken seriously. As Hayek points out, Rousseau is much dearer to the general public. The Hume skepticism is directed towards everything static, towards generalizations and common sense beliefs, such as the simple acceptance of causal relationships in the external world. It is Hume's concern to question these and show the uncertainty of knowledge of matters of fact. For most common sense, the causal relation has two important characteristics. First, there is a necessary connection between the cause and effect, and connection. Two, that such is the cause that contains a power of force that generates the effect. In other words, common sense naively believes that a given cause must always have a given effect, and that this is true by virtue of a certain power of force residing in the cause. Hume rejects these assumptions. As all events are, says Hume, distinct and separable from another, there is not much left of the cause in the effect. It is our imagination which creates our belief in strict causality. Hume arrives at the conclusion in section 7, part 2 of an inquiry concerning human understanding, that causal relationships should rather be referred to as constant conjunction, as he calls it, since this is what we in effect perceive. It is only our experience that lets us assume the sun will rise again tomorrow. It is just as likely that it will not rise again, and it is just as likely that hitting a bowling pin will not necessarily lead to it to fall over. Logical inference would make us believe in the necessity of causal relationship. But everything else can just as likely happen. So what Hume here sees also is whether formal logic does it all apply to sensual experience, and why should it? Why should a formalized, abstracted system make up experience or fully exhausted? By the way, the Kantian project is not really epistemology. In the first critique, what Kant really is trying to do with the establishment of the revolutionary way of thinking that he calls transcendental idealism is to give again validity to formal logic, so that formal logic does apply to experience. That comes at a very high cost, which is that experience, or appearance rather, does never lead to what things are in themselves, to the essence of the world, but instead appearances have to adhere to the categories of the concepts of the understanding. The question is thus, so what Hume really achieves here is a fundamental critique of metaphysics, of the early modern metaphysics, that bases itself in formal logic. The question is thus whether we really know the cause. If so, then we could infer the effect. Yet following Hume, we are not capable of that. The external world, by the way, you could also say, sorry, just to go in that direction again, but you could also point out that if in our hyper technicized world, we continuously posit desired effects, right? For example, the reduction of CO2, that's a very desired effect for whatever reason. And after positing that desired effect, we posit the causes which we assume will necessarily lead to that desired effect. With Hume, no such power over the external world, over nature, is possible. It is our rampant imagination that dreams up these perfect causal relationships at great cost. The external world is not one of mechanical stability to Hume, which is the exact opposite to Descartes, where the world is mechanically stable. I am looking at the same tree seemingly outside my window as I do every day, or so I assume from its appearance. Yet it is a different tree in every moment. Hume thus demands us to reject the notion of a common sense, of an independent and continued existence of objects. Experience, memory of stored impressions, and ideas enable us to handle the external world. Here's a long quote from Hume. "'Tis therefore by experience only that we can infer the existence of one object from that of another. The nature of experience is this: we remember to have had frequent instances of the existence of one species of objects, and also remember that the individuals of another species of objects have always attended them, and have existed in a regular order of contiguity and succession with regard to them. Without any farther ceremony, we call the one cause and the other effect, and infer the existence of the one from that of the other." End of quote. Everything just outlined is important when we try to understand also modern day economics, especially someone like Hayek. Now, Hayek is opposed to any generalization as aggregates in economic theory. This is why he denies the validity of macroeconomics to have any validity. And also, economic planning assumes the cause-effect relationship to be correct and predictable. Again, the CO2 example, which is a prime example of social, economic, central planning. The desired telos, or effect, could be, for example, social justice also, which leads the planner to generate a cause leading to the desired effect. Yet with Hume, the cause is not in the effect and can hence lead to anything. Hayek, in turn, believes the ultimate outcome of teleological social planning is serfdom. Hayek's claim on the strict causal necessity of collective planning leading to totalitarianism is, in light of Hume's theory, a relevant aspect. So according to Hume, there is no objectivity, as for example in beauty or value. Qualities such as these are merely subjectively determined by every individual's personal evaluation, without an eternal idea of beauty or an intrinsic value of things. So at last, but not least now, Hume's account of sympathy I should maybe touch on briefly as well. For Hume, to quote him again, we have no such extensive concern for society but from sympathy. Sympathy is similarly important to Hume as it is to Adam Smith. So here again, this is how Hume solves the issue that so that his theory doesn't lapse into a crude solipsism. Sympathy is the foundation for rules in an extended order or society, as people do not base their actions merely on self-interest. Sympathy, Hume says, takes us so far out of ourselves as to give us the same pleasure or uneasiness in the characters of those which are useful or pernicious to society, as if they had a tendency to our own advantage or loss. It is sympathy, then, that allows for cooperation and compromise and contributes to the order of the great society, as Adam Smith would later come to name it. So this virtue of sympathy is, of course, lacking in someone like Hayek, and which is striking also because Hayek does pretend that he stands firmly in the tradition of the Scottish Enlightenment. And again, to point this out, the assumption that the Homo economicus can be based on Adam Smith and maybe also David Hume is presumably also misguided, precisely also again because we are not transparent to ourselves, and in Hume and in Smith, human beings have sympathy for others. Thank you very much for listening.